Jack Spade rode hard, his grip tight on the reins, his mind running faster than the galloping hooves beneath him. So much had happened. Too much. Less than a week ago, he was in his own home, waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for a glass of water. Then, the mirror. The mirror that had taken everything from him once. His wife, his peace, his normal life. And now it had thrown him into a world where men like Hot Hand Tim Riley roamed the West like living legends. A world where the law meant nothing, and a man only survived by the strength of his gun and the fire in his soul. And somehow, Jack had survived. But more than that, he had changed. For years, people thought Rachel was just gone. No leads, no clues. Vanished without a trace. Jack had mourned her, had grieved, had tried to move forward, even though every day felt emptier than the last. But she was here, not in some afterlife, not in some dream. Rachel was alive, breathing, trapped in Pierre's grasp for who knows how long. And he had one chance to get her back. One. And he wasn't going to waste it. Jack clenched his jaw, shifting slightly in his saddle. His fingers still felt stiff from gripping his revolver too tightly, from pulling the trigger. Ace Vandermeer was a monster of a man, a legend, a killer. Someone who had tried to snuff out Hot Hand Tim Riley, not once, but twice. Jack knew if he hadn't taken the shot, Hot Hand would be dead right now. And Jack wouldn't have survived the night. It was self-defense. It was necessary. But none of that changed the fact that he had killed a man. He had felt Ace's life leave his body before his boots even hit the ground. Jack wasn't sure how to process it, so he did what Hot Hand did. He pushed forward. There would be time to think later. If he let himself hesitate, if he let himself doubt, Rachel was dead, Pierre would win, and Jack refused to let that bastard win. Jack turned his gaze slightly, looking toward Hot Hand. Tim Riley rode calmly, his body moving effortlessly with the horse. A man who had risked everything for him. A man who had torn down a corrupt town single-handedly, took down a mountain, and burned Pierre's entire world to the ground. And now he was riding with Jack Spade. Jack had never had a role model, never had someone to look up to. But Hot Hand wasn't just any man. He was the kind of man Jack wanted to be. And if Hot Hand Tim Riley wasn't afraid to take on Pierre's entire empire alone, then neither was Jack. For the first time since Jack stepped foot into this world, he didn't feel like a lost outsider. For the first time, he wasn't the one running, hiding, surviving. He was on the hunt. Jack Spade and Hot Hand Tim Riley were storming the castle. No backup, no army, just two men against whatever hell awaited them. They didn't know how many men Pierre had waiting for them, didn't know what obstacles they would face, didn't know how bloody this was going to get. And Jack didn't care. Rachel was his. Pierre had taken her from him, and he was coming to take her back. No matter what it took. Jack's face, once clouded with doubt, hardened with determination. His grip tightened on the reins. His rage burned into focus. With a quick snap of the reins, he spurred his horse faster, riding alongside Hot Hand. "Let's end this." Hot Hand gave him a quick glance, then grinned. "That's the spirit, kid." Together they rode. Straight toward Pierre Dubois' personal residence. Straight toward war. The hoofbeats of Pierre Dubois' horse thundered against the dry Montana soil as he pushed the exhausted beast faster and harder through the darkness. His mind burned with fury, his jaw clenched so tight it felt like his teeth would crack under the pressure. Ace, that brainless, arrogant brute. Pierre had trusted him, paid him handsomely, and what had he done? Failed. Failed once when he swore Hot Hand Tim Riley was dead, and now likely failing again because if Hot Hand was still breathing, then it was only a matter of time before he came for blood. He better not botch the job again, Pierre hissed through gritted teeth. When he got back, he was going to triple the guards, put every hired gun on watch, and burn through his fortune if he had to, but he would not lose again. The dark night sky stretched endlessly above him, an eerie reminder of the abyss he was staring into. A chill ran up his spine, not from the cold, from what he had seen, from what Hot Hand had done. His mine, gone, his town, burned. Everything he built, everything he fought to control, gone in an instant. The smell of smoke still lingered in his mind, still clung to his clothes. Hot Hand had turned his empire to ash. But when Pierre got back, Elizabeth and Rachel were going to pay the price for bringing those useless men into his town. Pierre would make sure of it. He dug his spurs deeper into the horse's sides, forcing it to keep up the brutal pace. It hadn't eaten, hadn't rested, and Pierre didn't care. Then, a sharp lurch. The horse's legs buckled, and before Pierre could react, the beast crashed forward, throwing Pierre violently off its back. His body hit the hard earth, and the impact knocked the wind out of him. He lay there, gasping for breath, stars spinning in his vision. His chest ached, his limbs burned, but all he could hear was the ragged, labored breathing of his fallen horse. Pierre rolled onto his side, coughing, wheezing. His whole body throbbed from the fall. Finally, after several long seconds, he forced himself to his feet. His fury snapped back like a rubber band pulled too tight. "Stupid old horse!" he roared. His voice echoed into the darkness, swallowed by the endless wilderness. He turned back toward the collapsed animal, rage boiling his blood. "I'm still 2 damn days away!" The horse didn't move, didn't even flinch. It had given him everything, and he had taken it all. Without a second thought, Pierre strode over to it and kicked it, hard. The beast let out a weak, pained grunt, too exhausted to even cry out properly. Pierre sneered. Compassion had left him long ago. Now there was only hate, only revenge. A distant echo made Pierre freeze, a low, eerie howl, then another, and another. Pierre whipped his head around, scanning the dark tree line. His stomach dropped. The howls weren't just noise. They were a message. A pack was nearby, and they knew he was here. Pierre felt a rare ripple of fear slide down his spine. If he stayed, he was dead. He had no time to feel sorry for the damn horse. So, with quick, precise movements, he ripped open his saddlebags, grabbing his weapons, his supplies, anything he could carry. Then, a thought, a cruel, calculated thought. Pierre pulled his hunting knife from his belt. Without flinching, he sliced deep into the horse's flesh. The animal let out a final, pitiful cry, but Pierre didn't care. Blood poured onto the dirt, the stench thick in the air. The wolves would smell it. They'd feast on the dying beast and leave Pierre alone. Arrogance curled his lips into a smirk. He was so damn smart. Pierre turned his back on the dying horse, his coat billowing as he took his first steps toward the long 2-day march ahead. He wasn't worried. He had survived before. He had built an empire, climbed to the top, and crushed anyone in his way. Ace had failed, but Pierre wouldn't. He was going to get back home. And when he did, he was going to make Hot Hand Tim Riley and Jack Spade suffer in a way no bullet ever could. His pace quickened, his mind buzzing with rage and plans for revenge. Every stride fueled his hatred. Every breath fueled his purpose. He was not defeated. Not yet. And as the moonlight bathed him in silver, Pierre Dubois, ruined but unbroken, vanished into the night. A 2-day march ahead of him, while 2 men rode on the warpath toward his doorstep. 2 races, 2 different missions, but only one of them would make it out alive. Jack Spade moved silently, crouched low among the thick pine brush, every step calculated. The weight of his revolver felt natural now, like an extension of his body rather than some foreign tool of death. They had been riding for 2 straight days, but there was no exhaustion in him now. Only focus, only purpose. Pierre Dubois' fortress lay ahead, and he was not leaving without Rachel. As he followed Hot Hand Tim Riley through the tangled forest, Jack's mind flashed back to the past week, to the moment he first saw the mirror ripple, to the moment he stepped into this world, to the moment he saw Rachel again, real, alive, trapped, and now, to the moment he killed a man. Jack had never thought of himself as a killer. He was just a man, a lost soul who had been grieving his wife for years, drowning himself in alcohol and regret. And now, in the span of days, he had become something else entirely. A gunslinger, a hunter, a man on a mission, a man who would do anything, anything, to bring Rachel home. Jack felt no fear now. Before, when he and Hot Hand had fought for their lives, when they were hunted like dogs, he had felt that fear crawl into his bones. But not now. Now they weren't running. They weren't surviving. They were hunting. Jack and Hot Hand were storming the castle, and Pierre would never see them coming. The mere thought of Rachel locked away, suffering under that bastard's rule, made his blood boil. She wasn't some prize to be stolen. She wasn't some possession to be owned. She was his wife, and Jack was coming for her. As they crouched behind a fallen tree, Hot Hand gripped Jack's shoulder firmly. "From here on out, we move in silence." His voice was low, deadly. "We get to the outskirts, we study, we plan. We don't go in blind, and we don't make a damn sound until it's time." Jack nodded once. "Ready?" There was no hesitation. "Ready." Hot Hand took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. His mind drifted back in time, back to the night everything was stolen from him, back when he was just Tim Riley, a man with a wife, a home, a future, until Pierre took it all, the sound of Elizabeth screaming, the crack of fists against his ribs, the taste of his own blood in his mouth, the laughter. Pierre's whistle still rang in his ears, haunting him like a specter. He remembered the helplessness as he was dragged from town, beaten, broken, robbed of everything he had ever loved. Pierre had told him there were no heroes in this world, no God, no hope, and Tim Riley had believed it for a time, until he became something else, until he became Hot Hand, and now he was coming back to finish what should have ended long ago. The fear was gone. Only cold, calculated vengeance remained. Pierre wasn't going to live through this night. Jack and Hot Hand covered their tracks carefully, using pine branches to erase any trace of their path. Every step was silent, every movement precise. Jack's breathing slowed as they crept closer and closer through the thick brush. Then, through the trees' flickering firelight, Pierre's fortress loomed ahead, a massive colonial mansion surrounded by barbed wire fencing and dozens of armed men. Jack's heart pounded. This was it, the moment everything changed. Jack and Hot Hand exchanged one last silent nod. Then, like ghosts in the night, they disappeared into the shadows. The hunt had begun. Rachel's hands ached from gripping the sickle too tight. Her arms were weak, her body frail, but she kept moving, slicing through the golden wheat under the merciless sun. There was no talking, only the sound of blades cutting through stalks and the occasional clink of the ankle chains binding her to Elizabeth. Every woman in the field was shackled in pairs, forced to drag each other through the long, grueling days. Some of them could barely stand. Too malnourished, too dehydrated. But it didn't matter. If you could hold a sickle, you worked. If you couldn't, you worked anyway. There was no rest, not until the sun was gone. Rachel had long since stopped asking questions. Why her? Why this world? Why did the mirror take her from a life she once knew? She had cried for days after arriving, wandering through the unfamiliar wilderness, thinking maybe, just maybe, she was dreaming. Until reality set in. She was a woman in the 1860s, alone, with no husband, no money, no identity. She couldn't buy land, she couldn't work, and every time she asked for help, she was met with either pity or lustful greed. The world was not made for women like her, and so she did what she had to do. She survived. She remembered Pierre's first smile, the charm in his voice, the way he spoke as if he was the most righteous man in all of Montana. Wealthy, well-respected, a man with connections. Rachel had never loved him, but she saw a way to survive. And in this world, that was all that mattered. She never expected Pierre to be kind, but she also never expected him to be a monster. The moment he won the bid for the mountain, the moment Eladium became his, he changed. Compassion died. Pierre didn't see people anymore, only numbers, only what could be used, what could be sold, what could be owned. Rachel wasn't the only one he married. Pierre was rich, too rich, and as he built his empire, more women came. One, then two, then many. Then, before any of them realized it, they were no longer wives, they were property. Freedom became a distant memory, and any woman who tried to run, who dared to hope for something more, she was hunted down, she was made an example of. Rachel had stopped fighting long ago. She had become numb, going through the motions, waiting for each day to end, only to repeat the same hell the next morning. But then, the glimmer. The sun was finally setting, casting the wheat fields in hues of orange and red. Rachel wiped the sweat from her dirty face, her body aching as she fell into line with Elizabeth, heading back toward the house. Then, a flicker of light caught her eye, a quick, sharp reflection flashing across the ground in front of them. She stopped. Elizabeth did too. Another flash. This time it skimmed over their dresses. Rachel's stomach tightened. That was not normal for years. Every day in this place had been the same. Every hour, every task, every moment of suffering. Identical. There was nothing new here, no surprises. Until now. Rachel and Elizabeth both scanned the fields, eyes darting across the golden wheat, searching. Where was it coming from? Then, Elizabeth's grip tightened around Rachel's hand, her fingers like iron. Rachel turned to her and followed her gaze. Her breath hitched. In the far distance, near the tree line, was a faint glimmer. Faint, hard to catch, but it was there. Then another flash. This time it hit Elizabeth's chest, right over her heart. The light flickered, drawing the shape of a heart. Rachel's pulse quickened. Elizabeth's lip quivered, her eyes welling up with tears as she whispered a single word. Tim. Rachel's heart stopped. Tim Riley. The name she had only heard once. The name Elizabeth spoke in hushed whispers when she told her story of how she came to be here. Rachel didn't know what happened to him, didn't know if he was dead or alive, but looking at Elizabeth now, the way her body trembled, the way she held on to Rachel like she was afraid she would disappear, she knew. Tim Riley was here, somewhere, and he was coming. Ladies, get in line and get back to the house. I ain't telling you again. The bark of a guard on horseback snapped them out of their daze. Rachel and Elizabeth scurried forward, blending back into formation. But as they walked, Rachel felt something new, something she hadn't felt in years, something she had forgotten even existed. Elizabeth wasn't walking like a prisoner anymore. She wasn't broken, empty, lifeless. She was smiling. Rachel stared at her, shocked. What the hell did she have to smile about? There was no hope in this place, no escape. Pierre was coming back soon, and when he arrived, he was going to make an example of someone. She could feel it. She could already hear the screams, and yet Elizabeth smiled like she knew something Rachel didn't. Rachel clenched her fists, forcing her thoughts aside. There was no time to question it now. Jack turned quick to look at Hot Hand, and he would have never expected to see him tearing up while looking through the scope. Fixing his attention back on watching their backs, Jack doesn't question. Instead, he gets a hard tap on the shoulder with no words. Hot Hand motions for him to look at the scope. As soon as Jack gets his vision cleared in the lens, he sees her. "It's Rachel," he muttered out loud, to be silenced quickly by Hot Hand. "And Elizabeth, you know the plan. We go on my signal." Jack nods. The very last ray of sun vanished, and night began to cascade the world rapidly. The women were stalling, walking slowly, being barked at by riders. Hot Hand counted 14, 4 riders, and 10 men. There was a hole up north of the women on the side of the fence line, outposting the plantation. "That's where we sneak it." Then, as they were scouting, a distant gunshot came from the main entrance of Pierre's house. All the women and guards stopped. Then another and another. All horses and men raced to the drive entrance. "We go now!" Jack couldn't even respond, he just followed, and off they raced. Pierre raced in agony down his long stretch of driveway. His lungs were on fire, he was beyond exhausted, and the pain from the wolves was getting at him. He could bet for sure they would have go for the horse, but they must have been following his scent. The pack has been on him since day, stalking in the woods waiting for the opportunity for the nighttime to shadow their attack. Right about as Pierre made it to the head of his driveway, they came in for the kill. He was bitten multiple times, scratched and tackled. The 3 shots he let out scared them and hit 2. He wasn't sure how many were lurking in the dark. He unloaded the rest in his revolver as he kept running. He could see in this distance his men coming on horseback, but that seemed to ignite the wolf pack's fury to hurry and finish the job. Pierre raced to reload while he had a few moments, and just as he did, he cocked it and turned to meet a monstrosity of a beast in midair, leaping right at him. Pierre had enough time to let out 3 shots, and the weight of the massive beast pinned Pierre to the ground. The pack came. Wolves bit on each of his legs and arms, and he looked at one in the eyes as it snarled, approaching his fast. Pierre screamed at the top of his lungs, and then the wolf shot back 3 feet, being shot through the head, and his men came to save him in the nick of time. "Get this off me," Pierre shouted. They freed him and got him to his feet. He was a scene out of pure horror. Blood covered him, and he could barely stand straight. They got him on horseback, made sure the wolves were gone, and raced home to fetch the doctor. Getting closer, Pierre's blurry vision straightened, and he could see in the far dark silhouette of the moonlight 2 men, free and stealing all his wives and slaves. "Thieves! Kill them!" Exhaustion left his body, and adrenaline of pure rage took over to race and stop Jack Spade and Hot Hand Tim Riley once and for all. Jack and Rachel darted low through the wheat fields, keeping their bodies as close to the ground as possible. The other women were still lying flat, terrified, expecting gunfire or a whip to crack at any moment. Rachel pressed her fingers gently to her lips, signaling quiet. She and Jack moved quickly, unlocking chains, whispering instructions. "Stay low. Stay silent. Head for the hole in the fence." One by one, the women nodded, their faces a mixture of fear and hope as they felt the shackles drop from their scarred ankles. Rachel worked just as fast as Jack, unlocking chains, helping women to their feet, and guiding them toward freedom. This was her moment. No more captivity. No more Pierre. She was taking her life back. But not alone. All of them were. Further down the field, Hot Hand and Elizabeth worked at the other end of the group, unlocking women as fast as their fingers could move. Elizabeth's hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage, from years of being stolen, beaten, controlled, but not tonight. Hot Hand kept his voice low and urgent. Once you're free, don't look back. Run for that hole and don't stop. The women nodded quickly, moving in silent obedience. The chains clinked, fell, and one by one they moved. Hot Hand was sweating, but focused. Then Elizabeth froze. Her hand clutched his wrist, her eyes wide. Hot Hand followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Two riders galloped toward the fields, Pierre's men. They must have heard the commotion or realized the gunfire wasn't stopping Pierre's hunters. They weren't coming for Pierre. They were coming to check on the prisoners. Elizabeth's grip tightened on Hot Hand's arm. They can't see them escaping. Hot Hand's teeth clenched. If those men sounded the alarm, they'd be dead before they reached the fence. His fingers twitched toward his revolvers. "No," Elizabeth whispered, already knowing his plan. "That will draw everyone back here." He nodded reluctantly. No guns, just knives. He pulled his blade, and Elizabeth did the same. She wasn't just escaping, she was fighting back. Hot Hand grinned. "That's my girl." The two riders approached fast. Two shadows moved through the wheat, silent as death. And before the men could even call out a warning, their throats were cut, silent, dead before they hit the dirt. Hot Hand and Elizabeth dragged their bodies into the wheat, making sure they were hidden. Then they moved again. More women to free. Jack could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The last chain dropped and the last woman was free. "Go! Go now!" he hissed. The women, one by one, scurried toward the fence hole, guided by Rachel. Hot Hand and Elizabeth met up with them just in time, moving fast. Jack grabbed Rachel's hand as they ran toward the exit, looking behind him for any signs of pursuers. But the field was still empty. Pierre's men were still distracted. It was too perfect. They were going to make it. Then, a single gunshot rang out, and a scream followed. Jack whirled around, his heart stopping cold. A woman had fallen, clutching her leg, shot. A silhouette stood at the top of the hill, panting, swaying. Pierre Dubois, bleeding, sweating, wild-eyed and crazed, his gun shaking in his hand. He was half dead already, but he wasn't finished. Not yet. His red-rimmed eyes locked onto Hot Hand first, then Elizabeth, then Rachel. And something broke inside him. He let out a hoarse laugh. "You think you can just take what's mine?" He raised his gun. Aimed for Rachel, Jack's blood ran ice cold. Not this time. Not again. Before Pierre could pull the trigger, Jack did first. One shot, straight through Pierre's chest. His body stiffened, his gun dropped, and Pierre Dubois collapsed. Dead. For good. Freedom at last. A shaky breath left Jack's lips. Pierre's body lay motionless in the dirt. Jack felt Rachel's arms wrap around him, her body shaking as she sobbed into his chest. It was over. Hot Hand stood over Pierre's corpse, breathing heavy. He took a long, slow spit on his body and muttered, "Rot in hell." Then he turned, pulled Elizabeth into his arms, and kissed her like a man making up for every stolen moment. The women were free. The night was theirs, and Jack, Rachel, Hot Hand, and Elizabeth had won. For the first time in a long, long time, Jack felt hope again. And as the first light of dawn kissed the horizon, they rode, free, together. No one in the group had a clue of where they were going next, or what was going to come their way. The only thing they knew is they had to get the women to a safe fort first, and then they can all discuss what's next. Looking the remains for supplies of Pierre's residence, they had horses, 2 fully stocked wagons that the women can ride in, and some spare horses to follow. As the gorgeous morning sun glows a violent red, depicting the blood spilling the night before, the group started the way towards their next goal, freedom. Jack Spade clutched his arm around Rachel, accompanying him in the front seat. They both gazed at the sun together and then bathed in another eye. Tears began to well as she pushed her head into his chest. Not a word was spoken, and no one was needed at this moment. Jack looked over at hot hand Tim Riley, doing the same to his Elizabeth. Jack couldn't have imagined everything would have ended so blissfully. Despite all the horrors and trials they had faced, they endured and they are all together.